Horned helmets, dragons, beards, axes, swords, shields, ships, wars. Does this all remind you of something? Game of Thrones? Pretty close. It's the notorious seafaring warriors, the Vikings. You must have heard of this word. If more, you would have seen them in some of your favorite mainstream movies and TV shows. Welcome. You're listening to TALRadio, powered by Touch a Life Foundation, and this is Foodology. I'm radio host Devansh, and on this show, I talk about the enormous world of a little word called food. Many stories, songs, and folklores were passed down orally over the years. While they are sure to have been twisted and misinterpreted, to a certain extent, the Icelandic scholars wrote them down a few hundred years later. The combination of these stories, along with archaeological evidences, give us an insight into the short yet significant history of the Norse people and the Vikings. Okay, first things first. How would you actually describe Vikings? Just like the ones you've seen on TV or read about in the books? Well, that could be a little over-exaggerated. Let me tell you. The Vikings came from what is now known as Scandinavia, which includes Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. They were rather small groups of free people and explorers from all over that region. The fact that Vikings were seafaring warriors who went on expeditions and plundered ships is true only to a limited extent. And it's alright because that's how they're portrayed in media, but the reality is quite far from that. A thing that most of us might not know is that Vikings were excellent farmers and loved to be on the land, cultivating food and developing new ways to store that same food for the harsh winters. They were not just raiders, they had societies, taxation, alliances, communities, and whatnot. They deserve so much more credit than we give them. During their short 3 centuries, they thrived and created an impact on the world between 800 to 1100 AD. Their reputation as invaders, barbarians, or even predators was quite magnified. These Norse people were initially pagan and targeted the wealthy Christian monasteries in their raids, but they later converted. They spoke Old Norse language, which had a striking influence on English. In the 8th to the 11th century, people did not refer to them as Vikings. The word Viking came much later, in the 11th century. Viking comes from the Old Norse word Vik, which means bay or inlet in the Old Norse language. People outside of Scandinavia refer to them as Dani, which meant Danes in Anglo-Saxon, and Pagani, which meant pagans, or they were simply referred to as Normani, which translated to North men. Though they undeniably carried out very destructive and violent attacks, from small-scale raids against churches to major campaigns involving thousands of warriors, the Vikings formed a very complex and sophisticated Scandinavian culture. In fact, did you know that the Vikings were also responsible for the discovery of Americas? Yes, it wasn't Columbus. The Vikings reached Americas 5 centuries before him. They were quite fascinating people who were centuries ahead of their time in design and society. And despite being known as fierce warriors, they had sophisticated elements to their culture that made them masters in all fields. And creating all this in such a short span of time, that too in the coldest corners of the world, is truly commendable. But what fueled them to achieve so much? Of course, it was their willpower, strength, and desire to conquer lands, but there's more to that answer. It was their food, Their diets. The Vikings were the most feared people in Europe at that time. So it's really intriguing to understand and know their diets and the food culture which sustained their strong, rather unique lifestyles. Life on the sea is not easy. Traveling on water for months, plundering and conquering with no guarantee of food and supplies at the destination, and in fact, most of the times the destinations were unknown. And not just that, even life on land was quite difficult, especially because the Vikings lived in the frozen parts of the world. Both of these aspects of life would have needed a decent amount of energy to keep everyone going. Right now, I know that I could leave my house, go to a store, grab a sandwich, a snack, and a drink, and return home in almost no time at all, or I could even order it at home. The total cost, including my time and the cost of food, would be less than an hour. For sure. But what about 1,000 years ago? We can't even imagine. The Vikings ate well. They knew how to raise food under the harshest of circumstances. They were skilled hunters as well as skilled farmers, and even beekeepers. It was them who most effectively used the art of preservation. As it is quite obvious that in order to maintain the Viking lifestyle, you need to intake a lot of energy. For them, fresh fruits and vegetables were quite hard to grow, and meat served as a main food source. And good for them that the North Seas provided abundant seafood, and the lands offered a variety of other animals. Norse farmers raised cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens for their eggs, wool, meat, and dairy. The Vikings only slaughtered these animals in winters to avoid having to keep them fed during the cold months. Many researches have been conducted in the modern times, stating that the Viking diet was actually quite modern and one of the healthiest in Europe at that time. And indeed, they did cherish their food. A typical Viking day included 2 meals, the dagmal or the day meal and the nattmal or the evening meal, which was had after everyone came back from their day's work. The day meal was light and consisted of leftovers from previous night like soup, bread, fruits, porridge, grains and nuts. The nattmal, on the other hand, was quite extravagant and heavy. Meats, stews, breads, drinks and desserts. Flatbread with honey and fruits were provided as sweet treats at the end of the meal. All of this would be washed down with mead or buttermilk. Bread was enjoyed with every meal, though it wasn't like the bread that we eat today. Barley was the most common grain because it's easy to grow and it pretty much grows anywhere. Other grains in a Viking diet include rye, spelt, oats, and some other grains in other parts of Scandinavia. When there was no time to grind grains into flour or let yeast raise the dough, Vikings simply boiled their whole grains until they were soft enough to swallow them. This porridge was probably not the sweet and wholesome one that we know today. It was more like add whatever is available. Despite their image as seafaring people, Vikings spent a lot of time on land. And while being on land, their diets came from cultivation. And as I mentioned earlier, they raised cattle especially for their milk. Apart from the obvious milk which was drunk, one of the main foods was butter. This would usually be done with the cream that rises on top of the milk. They also made cheeses from their milk and other fermented products. One dairy product unique to the Vikings is skyr. Skyr is similar to something like a Greek yogurt, but is technically a soft cheese. It is slightly sour, but also has slight sweetness to it. It is made from skimmed milk, so it's naturally low in fat and high in protein. Even today, Icelandic people enjoy this dairy delicacy. Auk was a bird which was enjoyed by the pagans. This bird is now extinct, but it was once a major part of their diets, along with chicken, pheasants, and not just birds. They ate any animal that walked the surface or swam the waters, like bears, horses, seals, walrus, venison, boars, and whatnot. We might imagine that all their food would be bland and plain, but we're wrong again. Vikings grew, or at least picked, a lot of herbs and spices to season their food. Dill, parsley, mustard, horseradish, mint, and thyme. These were common herbs which they used. Another misconception that we have about the Vikings is that they did not eat a lot of vegetables and fruits. That's not true. Their diets consisted a lot of it. Since they were hunters and gatherers, they definitely knew how to make the best use of whatever is available around them. Onions, wild garlic, legumes such as peas and beans met the Viking tables. They also ate a lot of root vegetables like beetroots, turnips, etc. Now, it is important to know that peppers, tomatoes, and potatoes did not arrive in Europe up until the 16th century. So these food items were naturally not a part of the Viking diet. Fruits such as apples, pears, plums, cherries, and some berries were also relished by them, mostly as dried fruits for winters and as desserts after dinner along with honey, which was the only sweetener available to them. They also incorporated seeds and nuts, especially walnuts and hazelnuts, and they even made oils out of these nuts. Apart from milk and water, which are obviously staple drinks for all the civilizations, the Vikings were also fond of beer and mead. Beer was made by fermenting barley with water. They probably would have known about adding hops for flavor too. The beer produced by these methods was fairly weak as per the modern standards, but safe to drink. Mead is a kind of wine-like drink made from honey. Ale became a common drink of choice. Weak ales for children and stronger ones for adults. Ale found its way to any social gathering, recreation, or a simple meal. Not to forget that Vikings went on sea voyages. For that, they took a similar approach to winter: preserved foods that wouldn't spoil for a long period of time, such as dried fish, grains, and dried fruits. Even dining tools from that time have survived ancient Viking history. These tools would look quite surprisingly familiar to most people today. Why? Because the Vikings were quite advanced and would eat their foods with handmade wooden utensils, skewers, forks, pots, and plates that look similar to what we use today. As the Vikings slowly transitioned and evolved from their old ways of raiding and warfare, they began to integrate themselves more and more into everyday European life. As their way of living evolved, they also began to adopt many of the culinary practice of their European counterparts, including different spices, flavors, and ingredients into their traditional Nordic food. The recipes and styles of cooking that followed that time period are now considered traditional Scandinavian food. By now, we all know that diet was one of the major advantages the Norse people had. For years, the Mediterranean diet has been considered ideal, but a new eating plan has emerged. That is the Nordic Diet or the Viking Diet. Studies have found that this diet has the potential to prevent obesity and keep off diseases like type 2 diabetes, heart diseases, high blood pressure, and even high cholesterol. In the 1980s, dietary experts from Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, and also Iceland, agreed on the Nordic nutrition recommendations and adapted them across each nation. These guidelines promote consuming plenty of fish instead of meat, consuming nuts, seeds, vegetable oils made from seeds such as flax seeds. A typical Nordic diet also encourages eating whole grains, such as rye and produce that grows well in the region's climate, like apples, beans, berries, cabbage, onions, pears, plums, root vegetables, to attain a better overall health index. There was clearly far more to Norse or the Viking diet than just the roasted boar on the spit or simple beer. Although Vikings are depicted as savage and barbaric warriors whose diet and personal hygiene were the least of their concerns, but the reality is that they took a lot of care about these two aspects. All of the foods consumed by the Vikings was made fresh and served fresh. They pioneered in many things. They were master shipbuilders, excellent warriors. They discovered America and standardized practices which still remain today. Thank you so much for sticking around with me on this episode of Foodology. I had an incredible time talking to you. This is radio host Devansh signing off. Hope you have a beautiful and a magical day ahead. See you soon.